So it's my pleasure to introduce Irène Tombo. Irène Tombo is a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of Political Science. She previously received a master's from Johns Hopkins University, and before that, a BA from the University of the Incarnate Word. Irène has broad interests in questions of political economy, in public goods provision, in questions of public authority and civil society and sub-Saharan Africa, with a specific focus on the Democratic Republic of Congo, where she was born. This paper grows out of a broader dissertation project. The paper, which is called Dimensions of Citizenship, the Case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, as the title suggests, is centrally focused on the question of citizenship. And her interest in this question, I think, stems from insights that she gained on prior field trips to the DRC, where she found Congolese in the streets claiming citizenship from the bottom up. And that gave rise for Irène to questions about what it means to be a citizen and what it means to be a citizen specifically and to participate politically in a state that some call collapsed or at the very least is distant. This is going to be the broad subject of her dissertation, and this paper constitutes an interim step towards that end, where she's examining how citizenship is codified and changes over time across successive Congolese constitutions. During her trips to the DRC, as perhaps Irène will talk about, she was struck by the ways in which ordinary Congolese claimed citizenship and made citizenship and practiced citizenship. And it was the creativity and the energy of the ways in which Congolese performed and enacted citizenship that captured her attention. As many of you know, the question of citizenship has long been a central issue for post-colonial Africa and studies of African politics. Under colonialism, Africans were treated as not as citizens, but as subjects, as Mahmoud Mamdani has influentially talked about. The question at independence and then later was how to change laws, how to change constitutions to ensure full citizenship for Africans. And with those questions in mind, Irène sort of waded centrally into the question of how citizenship was defined in constitutions in Congo and how that was updated over time. She collected close to 20 documents and analyzed them and came to a number of really interesting findings, which she shall share for us. Let me close by saying that Irène is a tremendous recipient of this Jordan Prize, which was named after a brilliant scholar who fled South Africa and made a name for himself in Madison. Irène and her family fled the war in the DRC, and she's now embarked on establishing a name for herself. She's brilliant and dedicated like Jordan, and it is my honor to work with her at this university. With that, I shall turn it over to Irène.
Thank you, Scott. I'll go ahead and share. Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you all for being here today. Thank you all for being here today, for taking your time to actually come and listen to this presentation. So at the very beginning, I would like to kick off the presentation by acknowledging and honoring the land that I'm on today. And I'll read through the UW-Madison's land acknowledgement statement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejup since time immemorial. In a 1932 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed, when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonialization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. And I want to thank you all again for being here today. And Before I jump into the presentation, I also want to thank my committee and both my advisors, Scott and Erica, as well as the research community in Kinshasa, which has been very encouraging and an instrumental force as I always go back to do fieldwork to work on the work that I'm working on, which right now is taking the shape of citizenship. So just to provide a quick roadmap of how the presentation will proceed. First, I'll talk about the background and motivation of this project, which Scott touched on, and then I'll talk about my research question. In this project specifically, I'll talk a little bit about the theoretical framework that I'm working with here, the methods that I use in this paper, and then the empirical context that I'm working within. And then I'll walk you through my findings from analyzing these documents. What are the implications of what I found? And then where my research is headed. So just a little bit of background for the project itself. So I was born in the Congo, a small town called Goma in Eastern Congo, where I spent 14 to 15 years of my life. The one thing that always intrigued me was public goods provision. Of course, back then I couldn't frame it as public goods provision, but I just noticed that the amount of resources that different places had throughout the country was never equal. And I also spent some time in Kenya. So I would always compare the Congo, at least the place that I knew as Congo, which is Goma, to what I would see in Kenya. And clearly a place like Goma, there weren't that many public goods. So I always wondered, why was this the case? So I was always curious. And that's how I got my interest in political science, and specifically my interest in trying to understand the Congolese state and the role that public goods play into this. So I was lucky to spend 2 summers to go back to the Congo, spend 2 summers in Congo and try and understand how people themselves view public goods. But then through trying to understand that, I realized that there is also a question about the role that people themselves see playing in a context as the Congo. Of course, the state is distant, at times absent, but I also wanted to understand how people themselves interpreted this and how this might play into how they understood their roles as citizens, not just legally, but also the social economic aspect of citizenship. So in this project specifically, my research question was trying to focus on the legal definition of Congolese citizenship. So how has the legal definition of Congolese citizenship evolved, and what are the resulting implications of this, of the way Congolese citizenship has been defined legally? And I thought this would be a first step before I even get to understand how Congolese themselves understand the notion of citizenship. So in terms of the theoretical framework that I'm working with here, first, I'm thinking about variety of meanings and publics. And the work that's relevant here is Eke's work, who, when thinking about how African countries are, he reminds us that citizenship has a variety of meanings. And most of the time, this depends on whether we're thinking about what he calls a primordial public, or if we're thinking about what he's referring to as a civic public. And this is the famous 2 publics notion that AK usually refers to in the essay that he writes in 1975. And here, when he's thinking of the notion of the civic public, which is usually related to the state, he's thinking of the conventional way that we may think about citizenship as a relationship between citizens and the state. But then when he's thinking when he's talking about what he calls the primordial public, this is where it's not necessarily the relationship between people and the state, but really it's very much anchored in people's ethnicity, so one's ethnic group. So it would be the relationship that you have towards your own ethnic group. So what responsibility do you have towards them? And now, more work that informs this project is the idea of a state that's bifurcated, so the bifurcation of the state. And here, Mamdani's book on citizens and subjects is relevant, where Mamdani is essentially, to summarize a lot of things that he talks about, there is this idea of civil authority and the native authority. And Mamdani is trying to think through what a lot of people have characterized as state failure in African countries. And he argues that it's not necessarily what we call state failure, but it's just the fact that a lot of these countries have gone through a different historical trajectory that than most European countries would have gone through. So he makes this distinction between a civil authority, which is authority that again ties back to the state, and you have civil laws that actually govern this realm of authority, and then you also have the native authority, and this is an outcome of indirect rule in a lot of African countries. So this creates two parallel forms of authority, and the native authority most of the time was anchored in ideas of ethnicity and customary law that governed this form of authority. So then here he also talks about this distinction between civil and ethnic citizenship, and the paper will mostly focus on civil citizenship. Two more ideas that are important here is Manbi, who reminds us of the importance of trying to understand how citizenship or nationality is defined legally, and how on the ground people actually try to make and build community. So this concept about belonging. So she argues that for us to extend the debate on citizenship to the continent of Africa, the idea of autochthony and indigeneity in Africa are important, but also we have to try and look at the definitions of nationality, the process by which nationality is acquired, and then the question of how a sense of belonging of community also important. And then lastly, someone else that I'm in conversation with is Sadiq, who remind us of the importance of post-coloniality as a lens of analysis. So he reminds us that when we try and use a post-colonial lens to understand a concept like citizenship, there are three main benefits from this. First, we try and understand citizenship from the viewpoint of those who are marginalized. And then it also provides us a mean to critique European experiences. And then the last one is it enables us to re-examine the liberal construction of citizenship. So with those four main works in mind, I also am in conversation with other authors, but I thought those would be worth highlighting before I move on to the empirical context itself. So if I'm thinking of citizenship as possibly having more meaning than the relationship just between the state and citizens, and also trying to see the concept as an outcome of colonialism that could have changed the way people see themselves and understand their relationship to the state, I thought the case of the DRC would be a place for me to try and understand how the notion of citizenship might have changed from independence to this day, or the latest national latest legislation on nationality. So just a little bit about the empirical context that I'm working with. 1960, the Congo gained independence from Belgium. And after that, chaos ensued. But then by 1965, Mobutu was able to seize power through a coup. And then by 1994, there was a Rwandan genocide in the Congo, which I'll bring up again much later, which is a relevant part of this question of citizenship. And then the first two Congo wars are also important to note when I'm thinking about the Congo, because one of the grievances that led to these two wars was the question of citizenship. And then eventually in 2009, Joseph, the father, gained power, and then later his son replaced him. And then much lately in 2018, there were elections and Tshisekedi became president. So throughout these years, I think three of the big events that are important here is how the Rwandan genocide might have changed the dynamics in the Congo. But even before that, I think the question of citizenship was still something that was contested, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the two Congo wars are also two big events to keep in mind as I'm going through the different documents that I'll be going through. So the methods that I use here, essentially I do a historical analysis of both constitutions and legislations in the Congo. And here I'm really treating constitutions as a colonial legacy. I see it as a formal institution that Congolese inherited from Belgium. And I'm trying to see how has the Congolese government, since it's been able to be in power, defined who is a citizen, who is excluded versus who is included, and what have been the impacts of the different definitions. So I break out the timeline into 5 different timelines: the pre-independence era, the First Republic, the Second Republic, which is from 65 to 1990, and then the transition period from 1990 to 2006, and then the Third Republic from 2006 to the present. And within each time period, I try to find relevant documents that either mention citizenship and nationality, and I try to see how these have been defined over time, if it has changed, if it has been more inclusive or more exclusive. So in the end, I end up analyzing 14 different documents over the different time periods. And one thing that you'll notice is that what was happening in the Constitution and these legal documents was very much a reflection of politics. And this is going to come up as I go through all the different eras that I'll be presenting about. So what I'm really interested on here is trying to grasp how both the Constitution and legislation have conceptualized the notion of citizenship or nationality, and then how has this evolved since independence, and then one thing that I think is very important in seeing like who has been counted as a Congolese citizen and who has been excluded from being a Congolese citizen. Okay, so what I end up finding is that in general, there is a historical crisis of citizenship, and this is reflected in the different documents that you see and the political instability that has emerged at different times in the Congo. So if we think about the pre-independence period, one of the documents that I spent time looking at were the resolutions that were adopted at La Table Ronde right before independence. And two things that struck me were the resolution 11 and the resolution that they have that was present in there about the electoral regime. So here there's a clear distinction that there are Congolese, and then there are also les ressortissants du Rwanda-Urundi. So when I use the term ressortissants du Rwanda-Urundi, because this is something that will come up again and again, I'm lumping together both the case of the Banyamulenge and the case of the Rwandophone in the Congo. So at the very onset of, even before independence, there was this distinction between Congolese and les ressortissants. And this was mostly, you could see this when you look at voting rights. So the resolution itself says that Congolese have a right to vote, but les ressortissants de Rwanda-Burundi do not have a right to vote. So there was already this distinction between who is Congolese versus who is not Congolese. And I think this sets the tone for the rest of the documents that we're going to see in this presentation. So during the First Republic, I looked at the constitution of Loi-Labour, and this is my own translation, of course. When it comes to citizenship, the constitution stipulates that all persons who are descendants or member of an ethnic group that was established on Congolese territory before October 18th, 1908 are Congolese by origin. And what's important here, or something worth noting, is a reference to an ethnic group and to the date that the ethnic group should have been established on Congolese soil. But then when you think about the immigration story, the immigration history in the Great Lakes region, the Kivu specifically, and then Rwanda and Burundi, it's a lot more complicated when you try to delineate who are the ressortissants de Rwanda-Burundi, mostly because when both Rwanda and Burundi were under the administration of the Belgian had a program that migrated Rwandans from Rwanda and Burundi to the Congo because they needed workers. So there was an influx of Rwandans and Burundians in Congo. So it becomes hard to delineate who is that group from, for example, the refugees who came in the Congo in 1994. So there's already that complexity in trying to say who was here during when Congo was still like a Belgian colony versus who arrived in Congo much later. So during the Second Republic, there are three legislations that are important. Well, two, and then one of them is an ordinance. So in the Second Republic in 1971, the date on, instead of saying that Congolese needed to be, an ethnic group needed to be there in 1908, that was changed to the time of independence to be more inclusive of other groups that could have been in the Congo at the time. And then in 1972, there was a special provision that was passed, and this special provision, a special provision that was in the 1972 law that made reference to the Kivu specifically. And it stated that those who were in the Kivus before 1950 and continues to reside there at the inception of the Congolese state could gain citizenship. And this is very much a reflection of politics at the time, because Mobutu relied on Congolese Tutsi elites to maintain and consolidate power. So he had an officer, Bisengimana, who was responsible for this law passing in 1972. But then much later, Bisengimana fell out of grace, and there was a law that was passed in 1981, which changed the date back to 1885, and the special provision about the Kivus was not in there. So this was completely excluded. So this is a lot of Mobutu trying to make sure Congolese elites who were in his entourage were happy. And one of the questions that was always debated was the question of nationality. So we see the ressortissants du Rwanda-Burundi who were in the Kivu being granted nationality, but this is later retracted, but also because Bisengimana was no longer in favor with Mobutu. So then during the transition period, and this is when both the first and the second Congo War actually happened. So one of the legislations that I spent time looking at was the Nationality Law of 1999. And here I'm mostly interested in 3 articles from that legislation. The first one, Article 4, provides a definition of what nationality is. And here again, the idea of one's ethnic group comes up because the definition of nationality is not just a link between persons and the state, but it also defines nationality as being a link between a person and a communauté de base, which most of the time I refer to this as an ethnic group. And then in the 13th article, les ressortissants du Rwanda ou Burundi are actually excluded from having any public function, from holding any public function. And then in the 9th article, the ability to petition for naturalization is actually changed from a community basis to an individual basis. So this means that a group like the Banyamulenge cannot petition for naturalization. It has to happen on an individual basis. So making it harder for the group to claim nationality. And as I mentioned, this was a time that the first Congo War, this was a time period that the first Congo War and the second Congo War happened. And one of the key grievances during this war was the question of nationality for the Banyamulenges and also the Rwandophones in general. So then the Third Republic, which is from 2006 to present, I look at the most recent constitution, which is the 2006 constitution, and then the Nationality Law of 2004, which was reproduced in the Code de Famille of 2017. So here then my question is, what determines citizenship by origin? Is it jus sanguinis, the right of the land, jus solis, right of blood, or a combination of both of this? So when I look at the Constitution stipulates again that any person who belongs to an ethnic group at which the members or persons and the territory are constituent to that which became the Congo, presently the Democratic Republic of Congo, at independence is Congolese of origin. So this is very inclusive. So it's not necessarily going back to the date of when the Belgian Congo was created, but it's looking at independence. But one thing that doesn't change is that there is still this reference to one's ethnic group. When I look at the Nationality Law of 2004, it's similar in the sense that ethnic groups and nationalities of persons come up again. The key time is independence, but I think the Nationality Law of 2004 and later, which is reproduced in the Code de Famille of 2017, tries to also stipulate that whoever belongs to the ethnic group that was present in the Congo at independence shall enjoy equal rights and protection in terms of the law as citizens. And this is the first time in most of the documents that I was looking at that there's an attempt to try and define like what does it mean to be a citizen, what does it mean to be a lawless person, and whether you have rights and responsibility that come along with it. So based on the Constitution itself, my conclusion would have been that it's based on the principle of jus sanguinis, because you have to be, there's the tie to the ethnic group that has to be established. But then the Nationality of Law of 2004, I think expands this a little bit more by providing both principles of jus sanguinis and the principle of jus solis. And 3 more articles that are relevant here is that both a Congolese mother and father can pass down nationality to a child. And then in the 8th article, there's stipulation that a child who is born on Congolese territory and the child's parents are not known is Congolese automatically. And then any child of foreign or stateless parents who does not automatically inherit their parents' citizenship is also Congolese by default. But I think there is a little bit of, or there is something else worth noting, in the sense that in the 2006 Constitution, the 6th article, and in the 2004 legislation, the 8th article, both of this capture this idea that Congolese nationality is exclusive, in the sense that you cannot hold any other nationality but the Congolese nationality. So if you are, I don't know, I'm American, for example, if I want Congolese nationality, I have to renounce my American citizenship to become Congolese. So I think that is a stipulation that's in there that complicates the situation, especially when we're thinking about the ressortissants du Rwanda or Burundi, because it's not just a question of whether they should have Congolese nationality or not, but it's, do they also have Rwandan and Burundian nationality, and do they have to renounce that before they can become Congolese? So that's a stipulation in there that's worth noting. So then what are my takeaways based on the analysis that I do on this constitution? First, I think there is this idea that one has to belong to the right ethnicity, and that would be the ethnic group that was present in the DRC at independence. So then the question of whether one is Congolese or not, which is the question of national citizenship, is very much anchored in this idea of belonging to an ethnic group that was present in the DRC at independence. And then I think Zongola's essay that he wrote in 2007 really captures this idea that, of course, there is always national citizenship, but that is very much anchored in what I think is ethnic citizenship or belonging to an ethnic group. And when he's talking about traditional African notions of citizenship, he reminds us that what really matters is not necessarily where you're born, but whether to be able to determine whether you're a son and daughter of the original soil. This is linked back to your parents. So if your parent is able to trace back their origin to the Congo, for example, then you automatically have citizenship. And then he also mentions how ethnic citizenship is the foundation for national citizenship in Africa, even though there are other ways that one could acquire naturalization. And I think this applies to the case of the Congo, and it's an extreme case in the sense that you can also find this stipulated in constitutions. I think the other place that might be this extreme is Côte d'Ivoire. But when you look at Congolese constitutions and legislation, it's very clear that yes, you can have citizenship, but first you have to belong to an ethnic group that is deemed to be an ethnic group that's Congolese. So then what are the implications of this? First, there is a tension that exists between civic and ethnic citizenship, in the sense that civic citizenship is mostly tied to the state, and a lot of the time, depending on how the state manipulates this, it aims to be inclusive, but also there is the notion of ethnic citizenship that is more exclusive than what the state itself might have as a goal. Just I'm going to plug my computer really quick. Right, and I think Gwenwen Alu's work, an article about Kenya in 2019, actually captures this when they're talking about the two principles that govern citizenship, how both jus solis and jus sanguinis allow for inclusion and exclusion in fundamentally different ways, depending on the moral of significance given to the accident of birth. and how this can be associated with a group and not necessarily the individual. And then, so this means that in a context like the Congo, we have two forms of membership recognition. One is a legal stipulation that you find in constitutions and legislation. And then the other one is whether or not you're accepted as a daughter and son of the soil. And then this forms citizenship within the margin of the state. And I think the Congo is extreme in the sense that you still find that stipulation about ethnic groups in the constitution and the legislation itself, themselves. And then the other thing is the contradiction of citizenship in post-colonial settings, in the sense that you have civil law, which comes from the state. And here the goal, most of the time, is inclusive. So anyone who qualifies as a Congolese citizen is Congolese. But then you also have customary law, which is more exclusive. And this is where ethnicity matters a lot. And this is very important because with being accepted like as a daughter and son of the soil, based on your ethnic group, it comes with access to land and governance. So you have constitutions that give you nationality, you have rights and responsibility, but embedded within it, there is also this notion of belonging to an ethnic group. And it's with that kind of belonging that really you have access to land and governance. And I think these two regimes are contradictory in the sense that if someone gets accepted as, if you're not accepted as a daughter and son of the soil, which I would argue is the case with les ressortissants du Rwanda or Burundi, there is still, the local population is never going to see you as being not worthy, as having the right to land and governance. So these two are, in a sense that they're very clashing. Yes, the state might say you have these rights, but really when we look at customary law, you don't, because it's customary law that governs lands and governance itself. And here autochthony is very important because it's on the basis of autochthony that different groups are either included or excluded. And this also dictates which rights you have in a territory. So then where am I headed with all this in terms of my future research? So one of the things that I think are worth looking further into is trying to understand not just the nature of the state, but also the nature of public authority that might not be state-centered and that might be important in everyday's life, and how these two might either complement each other, clash, or clash against each other. So this part of the project looks at legal text. And one thing that the project ends up focusing on by default is civic citizenship. But then it also misses other forms of belonging, which I think are important. Even though Congolese constitution and legislation make reference to an ethnic group, it doesn't necessarily provide more detail on what rights, for example, and responsibility belonging to an ethnic group comes with. And then there is this idea of what does citizenship mean substantively? And here I'm thinking of Greenhouse's concept of empirical citizenship. It's one thing to say, yes, you're Congolese, no, you're not Congolese, but also what does that look like on the ground? Like, how do Congolese themselves express their citizenship and practice it actually? How do they construct it and practice it in ways that could be different from how the state might expect citizens to practice it? And how do citizens understand their relationship towards the state and towards other forms of citizenships that other forms of citizenship that might exist? And here I'm thinking about ethnic citizenship And then the last thing that I would like to explore further is trying to not seeing civic and ethnic citizenship as too rigid categories, but trying to see how these two are in conversation with each other and how does that inform one's understanding of what it means to be a Congolese citizen, for example. And Nyamjo actually writes in one of his articles in 2008 that we should be thinking about citizenship in the context of Africa more as a flexible form of citizenship in order to understand what it means to be an African citizen, but then in my context, what it really means to be a Congolese citizen, to what extent does civic citizenship matter, and to what extent does ethnic citizenship matter, or how are these two in conversation to redefine how people themselves understand their role as citizens, and then the relationship to the state and other forms of public authority, and which form of public authority is more important. Does it, for example, does a local form of public authority is it seen as a more important form of authority than the state would? And how does this vary across the country? But thank you all, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Fabulous. Fabulous, Irène. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. So I just want to invite the participants who are on the Zoom to indicate if you have a question or not. And you could do so either through the chat function or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I'd like to ask Caden Paulson-Smith, I think who has an excellent question, if they could perhaps unmute themselves and pose the question. Or Caden, if you prefer, I can mention your question. Caden, are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, so Caden's question, I'll just read it. It says, thank you so much for sharing this brilliant project with us. Do you have a sense of whether there was an unwritten constitution or agreed upon set of norms that governed belonging and exclusion before Belgium introduced a written constitution? Or do you have any idea of how citizenship was conceptualized or delineated before formal colonialism began in the Congo?
Thank you for that question, Caden. So part of my project also seeks to understand, I don't think citizenship will be the concepts that I'll be working with here, but I think trying to understand ways of belonging before colonization. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how, even though a state does not exist in a lot of places, I think there was different ways that people belonged to, I don't want to even say ethnic groups because that is really an invention of colonialism, but how different groups belong to different kinship groups and what determined how you were included in the group and how you were excluded. So as it stands, I don't really have any form of evidence or anything that I could analyze to say that, oh, this is how people governed belonging versus not belonging, but it's definitely something that I plan to look into.
Great. I have a question from Lois. Lois, I'm going to unmute you. I don't see that I can unmute. Okay, I can unmute you actually. Lois, Lois, are you able to ask your question?
So one of the first question I have is, have there been legal cases trying to test these different ideas of citizenship? And second of all, how do the Congolese themselves feel about these ideas of citizenship?
Thank you for the question, Lois. So, which I think I should have said this in the beginning. To address your second question, my presentation was very much macro. What is happening at the national level? What are the constitutions and legislations that have been passed, and what has been the impact politically? One of the things that I really, really want to spend time understanding is, what do Congolese themselves think about the concept of citizenship, and how do they understand it? Because I think the constitution might say one thing, but perception of Congolese on the ground matters a lot, because I think that also shapes the reality, and it shapes what we actually see on the ground in terms of what's happening politically. In terms of legal cases testing both of these concepts, I'm thinking of the case of Banyamulenges, for example, and the fact that they have been excluded from gaining Congolese nationality. And I think in this case, it's a way of challenging this notion of ethnic citizenship, but it's never framed the way I'm framing it right now. Most of the time, people might say they don't belong, they're not from here because they're from Rwanda, but it's never expressed in a way that they don't have ethnic citizenship. Hence, they wouldn't have civic citizenship. It's always just a framing of they do not belong, so they shouldn't be included in terms of gaining nationality at the national level. I hope this answers your question.
Great. I have a question now from Anne-Marie Thompson. I believe you should be able to unmute yourself.
Oh, I was just wondering, Irène, I'm very impressed with your presentation. Thank you. You speak clearly and very impressive. And I don't want to sidetrack us too much, but the question for me always is if there is a link between the ethnic citizenship or civic citizenship, the exclusive versus inclusive, and the ongoing instability that characterizes Congo. So is it really a matter of citizenship, or is it more about natural resources and the economic issues that plagues the Great Lakes region?
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I think at the core of, and I think this goes back to Catherine Bone's work and Lund, who remind us that even though belonging to an ethnic group is something that by default happens to a lot of Africans, there are also rights and rights actually that come with that, which a lot of the time it's the right to have access to land and also the right to govern. So if you're thinking about resources, for example, at the end of the day, resources are on a piece of land. And if there is a group that believes that's their own land and they should have the final say on it, the conflict might seem like it's about minerals, but at the end of the day, it's about who should have access to that land and who should govern the different resources that come with that land. And then there's also the question of governance that is brought up there is, if you don't belong to an ethnic group, should you be governing a region of the Congo, for example? So I think even though the question of citizenship take like different forms to manifest itself, I think many, not all, but many of the conflicts that we have in Eastern Congo could be linked back to the question of citizenship and this two different understanding of what rights you have if you have civic citizenship versus if you're accepted as belonging to an ethnic group.
Irène, we have about 6 minutes and I believe 6 different interventions. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take them in panels. And so I'm going to read to you the 2 questions that come up in the chat, ask you to respond briefly, and then I'll go to the remaining questions. So the first question is from Kate Carter. Hi, Irène. Thanks for this great presentation. I have a question about the state and contemporary notions of citizenship. How do you think the use of biometric-based civil identification and voter identification can impact questions of citizenship and identity in the Congo? Do you think this is fundamentally an inclusive project of the state to identify people, or one of exclusion to restrict voting and participation? And a question from Erica Simmons. Thank you for the talk, Irène. I'm wondering if you can speak to how these legal constructions shape discourse and conceptions of belonging at elite levels and in everyday interactions with lower level bureaucracies. In other words, what work do you think the legal documents and language do?
Thank you both for these questions. So I'll start with Erica's question first. I think the case of the DRC is unusual in the sense that you actually find stipulations about one belonging to an ethnic group in the document itself. And I think this is a reflection of common understanding. And I think someone at the very local level, they might not necessarily frame it the way the Constitution frames it, but I would like to spend more time asking people if, because you always hear the sentiments of they do not belong because they're not Congolese, and then a reference to the ethnic group. So I think even at the very local level, there's that understanding that citizenship is anchored in ethnicity. And I think elites do a good job at manipulating that when it's convenient for them, which most of the time results in political instability. So I would say there is an understanding, and if anything, it's the local knowledge that informs what we see in the Constitution and the legislation. When it comes to Kate's question about biometrics and contemporary notions of citizenship, it's something that I'm interested in. And right now, as it stands, I think it's going to be a way of excluding people. First, I'm not sure how a project like this might be undertaken in the context of the DRC, but if it does, I think it creates a very concrete way of people being excluded. Because in this case, I'm sure most Banyamulenges would not qualify for, let's say, like a biometric passport. And by not having, most Congolese don't have passports, but if this becomes something that's required, for example, I think it formalizes exclusion, and it's not just something that people talk about and debate about, but you also have a document that shows whether or not you're Congolese or not. So right now, I think it will result in a lot of exclusion.
Great, thanks, Irène. So I'm gonna pose two more questions from the chat. We might go over just a couple of minutes, but I'd ask those who are in attendance if they can try to join us for these last couple of minutes. So the first question is from Sarah. Thanks for the great talk. I'm curious how these nationality laws have, or maybe have not, impacted the idea of belonging for indigenous groups in the DRC, like the Batwa. This might be outside the scope of research, but would love your thoughts on it. And then a question from Michelle Wagner. Hello, Michelle. Nice to see your name. Tensions between civic or political citizenship and legal citizenship in Congo have been complicated by the Congolese wars. Layers of authority, some being armed groups, have participated in defining who belongs, who has rights, who can govern. History itself has complicated the tension that exists now. How does a researcher deal with this? Thank you.
Thank you both for this question. I'll start with the last one. So over the years, the question of citizenship and multiple authorities that are present in the Congo even then complicates the question further. And I think it's interesting, and you bring this up, how sometimes different armed groups claim that what they do is because they're good citizens, which is very problematic. But I think at the core of this is the question of the Congolese state itself and how it's been able, whether or not it's been able to monopolize the force over violence, monopolize violence throughout the country and how the Congolese state has failed in people's everyday life and how might that uplift other forms of authorities. So I think it's very complex and there are other forms of authority. It might not necessarily be a form of citizenship, but just other forms of authorities that end up being more relevant in everyday life. And I'm thinking of the recent Ebola crisis that was just hard to maintain in a place like Beni because people did not trust the state anymore. But they trusted like local militias more than they did the state. And that completely changes whether or not how the state could have intervened to stop Ebola and how I think it shows the broken link between the state and citizens and how there are other individuals or other forms of public authority that end up inserting themselves there. The other question was about whether indigenous groups, correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, whether indigenous groups are influenced by the way nationality is defined?
Yeah, just how do the nationality laws impact indigenous groups like the Batwa?
Okay. So here I'm thinking when you're thinking of the Batwa, you're mostly referring to pygmies in the Congo. And I don't think I'm yet to come across a case that does not consider indigenous groups like the pygmies or the Batwas as not being Congolese. The question has always been Rwandophones or the Banyamulenge, which most of the time it goes back to Tutsis who are present in the Congo. So I need to look more into whether indigenous groups have been affected by the nationality law, but as far as I know, no, they haven't. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you all for being here today for Irène's talk. Thank you for the great questions. And please join me in virtually congratulating Irène, not only on a wonderful presentation and excellent answers to the questions, but also on being the winner of the Jordan Prize this year. And as you can see, I think there are more great things to come from Irène as she proceeds with her dissertation research on these and related topics. So thank you all. I think that Diana is likely to end this soon, but please join us for a future Africa at Noon.
Thank you all.